The Battle of Moscow is the name given by Soviet historians to two periods of strategically significant fighting on a 600 km sector of the Eastern Front during World War II. It took place between October 1941 and January 1942. The Soviet defensive effort frustrated Hitler's attack on Moscow, capital of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics and the largest Soviet city. Moscow was one of the primary military and political objectives for Axis forces in their invasion of the Soviet Union. The German strategic offensive, named Operation Typhoon, was planned to conduct two pincer offensives, one to the north of Moscow against the Kalinin front by the 3rd and 4th Panzer Armies, simultaneously severing the Moscow-Leningrad Railway, and another to the south of Moscow Oblast against the Western Front south of Tula, by the 2nd Panzer Army, while the 4th Army advanced directly towards Moscow from the west. A separate operational German plan, codenamed Operation Wotan, was included in the final phase of the German offensive. Initially, the Soviet forces conducted a strategic defense of the Moscow Oblast by constructing three defensive belts, deploying newly raised reserve armies, and bringing troops from the Siberian and Far Eastern military districts. Subsequently, as the German offensives were halted, a Soviet strategic counter-offensive and smaller-scale offensive operations were executed to force the German armies back to the positions around the cities of Oryol, Vyazma and Vitebsk, nearly surrounding three German armies in the process. Background: the original German invasion plan, which the Axis called Operation Barbarossa, called for the capture of Moscow within 4 months. On the 22nd of June 1941, Axis troops invaded the Soviet Union and destroyed most of the Soviet Air Force on the ground, advancing deep into Soviet territory using blitzkrieg tactics, destroying entire Soviet armies. While the German Army Group North moved towards Leningrad, Army Group South took control of Ukraine, and Army Group Center advanced towards Moscow. By July 1941, Army Group Center crossed the Dnieper River, on the path to Moscow. In August 1941, German forces captured Smolensk, an important stronghold on the road to Moscow. At this stage, although Moscow was vulnerable, an offensive against the city would have exposed both of the German flanks. In part to address these risks, in part to attempt to secure Ukraine's food and mineral resources, Hitler ordered the attack to turn north and south and eliminate Soviet forces at Leningrad and Kiev. This delayed the German advance on Moscow. When the advance on Moscow resumed on the 2nd of October 1941, German forces had been weakened, while the Soviets had raised new forces for the defense of the city. Initial German advance. He felt this could be accomplished by seizing the economic resources of Ukraine east of Kiev. When Walther von Brauchitsch, commander-in-chief of the army, supported a direct thrust to Moscow, he was told that only ossified brains could think of such an idea. Franz Halder, head of the Army General Staff, was also convinced a drive to seize Moscow would be victorious after the German army inflicted enough damage on the Soviet forces. This view was shared by most within the German high command, but Hitler overruled his generals in favor of pocketing the Soviet forces around Kiev in the south, followed by seizure of Ukraine. The move was successful, resulting in the destruction of 660,000 Red Army personnel by the 26th of September and further advances. With the end of summer, Hitler redirected his attention back to Moscow and assigned Army Group Center to this task. The forces committed to Operation Typhoon included 3 infantry armies, supported by 3 panzer groups and by the Luftwaffe's Luftflotte 2. Overall, more than 1 million German troops were committed to the operation, along with 1,700 tanks and 14,000 guns. German aerial strength, however, had been severely reduced over the summer's campaigning, as the Luftwaffe had lost 1,603 aircraft destroyed and 1,028 damaged. Luftflotte 2 had only 549 serviceable machines, including 158 medium and dive bombers and 172 fighters, available for Operation Typhoon. The attack relied on standard blitzkrieg tactics, using panzer groups rushing deep into Soviet formations and executing double pincer movements, pocketing Red Army divisions and destroying them. Facing the Wehrmacht were three Soviet fronts forming a defensive line between the cities of Vyazma and Bryansk, which barred the way to Moscow. The armies comprising these fronts had also been involved in heavy fighting. Still, it was a formidable concentration consisting of 1,250,000 men, 1,000 tanks, 7,600 guns. The Soviet Air Force, Voinovazdushny Sili, had suffered appalling losses of some 7,500 or 21,200 aircraft. Extraordinary industrial achievements had begun to replace these, and at the outset of Typhoon, the VVS could muster 936 aircraft, 578 of which were bombers. Once Soviet resistance along the Vyazma-Bryansk front was eliminated, German forces were to press east, encircling Moscow in similar fashion by outflanking it from the north and south. However, before plans got underway, the continuous fighting had reduced their armies in fighting effectiveness. Logistical difficulties became more acute as well. Guderian, for example, wrote that some of his destroyed tanks had not been replaced, along with fuel shortages at the start of the operation. The battles of Vyazma and Bryansk, the German attack went according to plan, with 3rd Panzer Army pushing through the middle nearly unopposed and then splitting its mobile forces north to complete the encirclement of Vyazma, with 4th Panzer Army and other units south to close the ring around Bryansk in conjunction with 2nd Panzer Army. The Soviet defense, still under construction, was overrun, and spearheads of the 2nd and 3rd Panzer Groups met at Vyazma on 10 October 1941. 4 Soviet armies were trapped in a large pocket just west of the city. The encircled Soviet forces continued their resistance, and the Wehrmacht had to employ 28 divisions to eliminate them, using troops which could have supported the offensive towards Moscow. The remnants of the Soviet Western and Reserve fronts retreated and manned new defensive lines around Modeysk. Although losses were high, some of the encircled units escaped in small groups ranging in size from platoons to full rifle divisions. Soviet resistance near Vyazma also provided time for the Soviet High Command to bring reinforcements up to the 4 armies defending Moscow. 3 rifle and 2 tank divisions were transferred from the Far East, with more to follow. In the south near Bryansk, initial Soviet performance was barely more effective than Vyazma. The 2nd Panzer Group executed an enveloping movement around the city, linking with the advancing 2nd Army and capturing Oral by the 3rd of October and Bryansk by the 6th of October. But the weather began to change against the Germans. By the 7th of October, the first snow fell and quickly melted, turning roads and open areas into muddy quagmires, a phenomenon known as Rasputitsa in Russia. German armored groups were greatly slowed, allowing Soviet forces to fall back and regroup. Soviet forces were able to counterattack in some cases. For example, the 4th Panzer Division fell into an ambush set by Dmitry Lyashenko's hastily formed 1st Guards Special Rifle Corps, including Mikhail Katukov's 4th Tank Brigade, near the city of Mtsensk. Newly built T-34 tanks were concealed in the woods as German armor rolled past him, as a scratch team of Soviet infantry contained their advance. Soviet armor attacked from both flanks and savaged the German Panzer IV tanks. For the Wehrmacht, the shock of this defeat was so great that a special investigation was ordered. Guderian and his troops discovered, to their dismay, that the Soviet T-34s were almost impervious to German tank guns. As the general wrote, Our Panzer IV tanks with their short 75mm guns could only explode a T-34 by hitting the engine from behind. Guderian also noted in his memoirs that the Russians already learned a few things. Other counterattacks further slowed the German offensive. The Second Army, which was operating to the north of Guderian's forces with the aim of trapping the Bryansk front, had come under strong Red Army pressure assisted by air support. According to German assessments of the initial Soviet defeat, 673,000 soldiers had been captured by the Wehrmacht in both the Vyazma and Bryansk pockets, although recent research suggests a lower, but still enormous figure of 514,000 prisoners, reducing Soviet strength by 41%. The personnel losses calculated by the Soviet command are smaller, but still massive, namely 499,001. On 9 October, Otto Dietrich of the German Ministry of Propaganda, quoting Hitler himself, forecast in a press conference imminent destruction of the armies defending Moscow. As Hitler had never had to lie about a specific and verifiable military fact, Dietrich convinced foreign correspondents that the collapse of all Soviet resistance was perhaps hours away. German civilian morale, low since the start of Barbarossa, significantly improved, with rumors of soldiers home by Christmas and great riches from the future Lebensraum in the east. However, Red Army resistance had slowed the Wehrmacht and the brutally cold Russian winter was only weeks away, when, on 10 October 1941, the Germans arrived within sight of the Mozhaisk line west of Moscow. They encountered another defensive barrier manned by new Soviet forces. That same day, Georgy Zhukov was recalled from Leningrad to take charge of Moscow's defense, with Colonel General Ivan Konev as his deputy. On 12 October, he ordered the concentration of all available forces on a strengthened Mozhaisk line, a move supported by Vasilevsky. The Luftwaffe still controlled the sky wherever it appeared, and the Stuckschwader and Kampfgruppen flew 537 sorties, destroying some 440 vehicles and 150 artillery pieces. On 15 October, Stalin ordered the evacuation of the Communist Party, the General Staff and various civil government offices from Moscow to Kuybyshev, leaving only a limited number of officials behind. The evacuation caused panic among Muscovites. On 16-17 October, much of the civilian population tried to flee, mobbing the available trains and jamming the roads from the city. Despite all this, Stalin publicly remained in the Soviet capital, somewhat calming the fear and pandemonium. Mozhaisk defense line. By 13 October 1941, the Wehrmacht had reached the Mozhaisk defense line, a hastily constructed double set of fortifications protecting Moscow's western approaches that extended from Kalinin towards Volokholamsk and Kaluga. Despite recent reinforcements, only around 90,000 Soviet soldiers manned this line, far too few to stem the German advance. Given the limited resources available, Zhukov decided to concentrate his forces at 4 critical points. The 16th Army under Lieutenant General Rokossovsky guarded Volokholamsk. Mozhaisk was defended by 5th Army under Major General Govorov. The 43rd Army of Major General Golubev defended Maloyaroslavets, and the 49th Army under Lieutenant General Zakharkin protected Kaluga. The entire Soviet Western Front, nearly destroyed after its encirclement near Vyazma, was being recreated almost from scratch. Moscow itself was also hastily fortified. According to Zhukov, 250,000 women and teenagers worked building trenches and anti-tank moats around Moscow, moving almost 3 million cubic meters of earth with no mechanical help. Moscow's factories were hastily converted to military tasks. One automobile factory was turned into a submachine gun armory, a clock factory manufactured mine detonators. The chocolate factory shifted to food production for the front, and automobile repair stations worked fixing damaged tanks and military vehicles. Despite these preparations, the capital was within striking distance of German panzers, with the Luftwaffe mounting massive air raids on the city. The air raids caused only limited damage because of extensive anti-aircraft defenses and effective civilian fire brigades. On 13 October 1941, the Wehrmacht resumed its offensive. At first, the Germans attempted to bypass Soviet defenses by pushing northeast towards the weakly protected city of Kalinin and south towards Kaluga and Tula, capturing all except Tula by 14 October. Encouraged by these initial successes, the Germans launched a frontal assault against the fortified line, taking Mozhaisk and Maloyaroslavets on 18 October, Narofominsk on 21 October, and Volokolamsk on 27 October after intense fighting. Because of the increasing danger of flanking attacks, Zhukov was forced to fall back, withdrawing his forces east of the Nara River. In the south, the 2nd Panzer Army initially advanced towards Tula with relative ease because the Mozhaisk defense line did not extend that far south and no significant concentrations of Soviet troops blocked their advance. However, bad weather, fuel problems, and damaged roads and bridges eventually slowed the Germans, and Guderian did not reach the outskirts of Tula until 26 October. The German plan initially called for the rapid capture of Tula, followed by a pincer move around Moscow. The first attack, however, was repelled by the 50th Army and civilian volunteers on 29 October, after a desperate fight within sight of the city. On 31 October, the German Army High Command ordered a halt to all offensive operations until increasingly severe logistical problems were resolved and the Rasputitsa subsided.